The crimson fires burned across the night sky of Ether Moor as the Elven Empire celebrated their greatest triumph in 3 centuries. Lyra Silvermoon stood atop the obsidian tower watching the victory pyres light up one by one across the capital city below. Her silver hair moved gently in the evening breeze, while her ancient eyes reflected the dancing flames. She had lived for over 800 years and fought in countless battles, but this victory felt different somehow. Beside her stood Nightwing, her dragon companion whose scales shimmered with patterns that looked like distant nebulas. The great beast was massive, nearly 50 feet from snout to tail, with wings that could blot out the sun. Nightwing's eyes glowed with an inner fire as the dragon shared in the moment of peace. The bond between them ran deeper than words. They could feel each other's thoughts and emotions like echoes in their minds. The war against the Crithian swarm had lasted 300 years. The parasitic alien race had consumed 17 star systems before the elven forces finally pushed them back. Lyra herself had led the final assault on their hive world, riding Nightwing through storms of bioplasma and living ships that screamed as they died. The memory of that battle still burned fresh in her mind. Below, in the city streets, millions of elves celebrated with songs and dances that had not been performed since before the war began. The elven civilization was ancient and proud, masters of both magic and advanced technology that merged the two into something beautiful and terrible. Their ships could fold space itself, their weapons channeled the raw energy of stars, and their warriors trained for centuries to achieve perfection. The High Council had declared a month of celebration. After so much sacrifice and loss, the people deserved to feel joy again. Lyra understood this, but something gnawed at the edge of her consciousness. During the victory feast earlier that evening, she had experienced strange visions, flashes of metallic ships unlike any she had seen before, symbols and writing in a language that felt alien yet somehow familiar. She had mentioned it to Counselor Maya Starweaver, the head of intelligence, but Maya had dismissed her concerns with a gentle smile. Maya had told her that after 3 centuries of constant warfare, it was natural for a warrior's mind to see threats even in peacetime. The counselor had suggested that Lyra take time to rest and heal. But Lyra knew herself better than that. She had fought in wars that lasted longer than most species existed. She recognized the difference between exhaustion and genuine warning. Nightwing shifted beside her and released a low rumble from deep within the dragon's chest. Lyra placed her hand on the dragon's scales and felt the unease flowing through their bond. The dragon kept staring at the empty darkness beyond their star system, at spaces between the stars where nothing should exist. Nightwing's ancient instincts, inherited from dragons that had flown between worlds for millions of years, sensed something that elven instruments could not detect. Lyra closed her eyes and opened her mind fully to the dragon's senses. Through Nightwing's perception, she could feel vast distances of empty space. But there in the darkness, something moved. It was too far away to identify, too faint to confirm, but it was there. Something large, something approaching. She opened her eyes and looked down at the celebrating city. Thousands of lights twinkled below as families reunited and warriors laid down their weapons. The Sky Fleet, the legendary armada of living warships bonded with dragon riders, rested in orbital docks above the planet. For the first time in centuries, the fleet was not on high alert. Commander Beth Nightshade, Lyra's trusted second-in-command, had joined the celebrations in the Grand Hall. Beth had earned her position through 200 years of distinguished service. She was young by elven standards, only 300 years old, but her tactical mind was sharp and her loyalty absolute. Lyra had tried to share her concerns with Beth before the feast, but even her closest friend had urged her to relax and enjoy the moment. The problem was that Lyra had never been good at relaxing. She had been born during the last great peace, trained during the rise of tensions, and spent her entire adult life at war. Peace felt strange and uncomfortable, like wearing armor that did not fit properly. Nightwing growled again, louder this time. The dragon's muscles tensed beneath the shimmering scales. Other dragons across the city began to respond, their calls echoing through the night. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. Dragons did not frighten easily. They were apex predators that feared nothing in the known galaxy. Yet now dozens of them were sensing the same thing that troubled Nightwing. Lyra activated the communication crystal embedded in her wrist bracer. She sent a priority message to the deep space monitoring stations at the edge of Elven territory. The stations were automated, maintained by magical constructs that never slept and never made mistakes. They had been silent for days, reporting nothing unusual in the vast emptiness beyond their borders. Minutes passed with no response. Lyra sent the message again with higher priority. Still nothing. She felt cold dread settling in her stomach. The monitoring stations always responded immediately. They were designed to be impossible to disable without triggering multiple alarms. Nightwing suddenly reared up on hind legs and released a roar that shook the tower beneath them. The sound carried across the city, causing the celebrations to pause. People looked up at the obsidian tower where their greatest warrior stood with her dragon. Even from this distance, they could sense that something was wrong. Lyra made a decision. She climbed onto Nightwing's back, settling into the familiar ridges between the dragon's shoulder blades. No saddle or harness connected them. Their bond was enough. She thought the command and Nightwing leaped from the tower, wings spreading wide to catch the air. They rose above the city in great spiraling circles, climbing higher and higher until the atmosphere thinned and stars became visible in the darkening sky. Other dragon riders saw them ascending, and some began to follow, confused but ready to respond to their commander's actions. Lyra directed Nightwing toward the orbital docks where the Sky Fleet rested. She needed to check the long-range sensors herself. She needed to know why the monitoring stations had gone silent. And deep in her ancient warrior's heart, she needed to prepare for the possibility that the celebration had been premature. As they approached the nearest orbital platform, Lyra saw something that made her blood freeze. The long-range sensor arrays were active and functioning normally, but the data they were receiving showed something impossible. The edge of their territory, where the monitoring stations should have been sending routine reports, now showed nothing but empty space. The stations had not gone silent. They had simply disappeared. All of them. Every single deep space monitoring outpost along their entire border had vanished without sending a single distress signal. And in the darkness beyond, the sensors were beginning to detect something new. Massive gravity signatures, hundreds of them. Moving closer. 3 days had passed since the monitoring stations disappeared, and the mood across Ethermore had shifted from celebration to careful concern. The High Council had convened in emergency session within hours of the discovery, and Lyra had spent most of that time presenting what little evidence they had gathered. The stations had not been destroyed in the conventional sense. They had been systematically dismantled and removed piece by piece, as if someone had wanted to study them. Counselor Maya Starweaver arrived at Lyra's quarters in the Obsidian Tower, carrying a data crystal that pulsed with an unusual amber light. Maya's normally calm face showed signs of strain. She had not slept since the emergency began, and it showed in the tight lines around her eyes. Maya was over 600 years old and had served as intelligence chief for 2 centuries. Lyra had never seen her look this troubled. Maya explained that one of the outer patrol ships had recovered a fragment of data from the location where Monitoring Station 7 had been positioned. The fragment was encrypted with a code that matched nothing in their vast archives of known alien languages and mathematical systems. The encryption was elegant and efficient in a way that suggested advanced intelligence, but it used principles that seemed almost primitive compared to Elven quantum encoding. They spent an hour attempting to decode the message using every method known to Elven science and magic. Finally, a young technician named Lisa Moonshadow managed to break through the first layer of encryption. What they found inside was disturbing. The message was not a communication intended for them. It was an internal log, something that had been accidentally broadcast when the station was being taken apart. The log contained mathematical formulas and observational data about Elven technology. Whoever had taken the station had been studying it in incredible detail, documenting every aspect of its construction and function. The analysis was thorough and showed understanding of concepts that most species in the galaxy could not grasp. But the methods used were strange, relying on binary computational systems rather than the quantum consciousness networks that Elven technology employed. Maya made the decision to take the data crystal to Lyra personally rather than present it to the full council. Some discoveries were too sensitive to share widely until their implications were fully understood. The two of them sat in Lyra's private chamber while Nightwing dozed near the window, the dragon's breathing slow and steady, but its eyes occasionally opening to watch the stars. Lyra examined the data with growing unease. Included in the recovered fragment were images, brief and incomplete, but clear enough to make out details. The images showed bipedal creatures in sealed environmental suits moving through the wreckage of the monitoring station. They were roughly the same size as elves, perhaps slightly shorter, with 2 arms and 2 legs and heads that seemed proportionally large for their bodies. The creatures worked with remarkable coordination and efficiency. They used tools that seemed crude by Elven standards, but were employed with such skill that the results matched or exceeded what Elven engineers could achieve. They cut through station components with focused beams of superheated particles, sorted the pieces with mechanical arms, and loaded everything onto transport vessels that hovered nearby. One image showed a clearer view of the creatures. Their suits were bulky and appeared to be purely technological with no magical enhancements visible. The helmets had transparent faceplates, and through one of them, Lyra could see the face of the being inside. It looked remarkably similar to an elf, but with softer features, shorter ears, and skin that appeared more varied in tone. The expression on its face was one of intense concentration and curiosity. At the bottom of the data fragment was a single decoded word in the strange language. The translation matrix had worked on it for hours before producing an approximate meaning. The word translated to something like assessment or evaluation completed. Below that was another phrase that made Lyra's hands tighten on the crystal. The phrase roughly meant proceeding to contact zone. Maya and Lyra discussed what this could mean. The obvious interpretation was that whoever these beings were, they had been evaluating Elven technology and now planned to make direct contact. But the manner of their evaluation, taking apart monitoring stations without permission or warning, suggested either ignorance of diplomatic protocols or deliberate disregard for them. Neither possibility was comforting. Lyra proposed taking a reconnaissance team to the site of the nearest disappeared station. She wanted to see firsthand what had been done and search for more clues about these mysterious beings. Maya agreed and also insisted on adding her own intelligence specialists to the team. They assembled a group of 20, including Commander Beth Nightshade and several of the most experienced dragon riders in the Sky Fleet. They departed before dawn the next morning, riding on dragons equipped with enhanced sensor packages and defensive shields. The flight to the station's last known position took 6 hours, even at high speed. When they arrived, what they found exceeded their worst expectations. The station had indeed been completely dismantled. Every component was gone. But in its place, the unknown beings had left something behind. Floating in the exact center of where the station had been positioned was a small satellite device, clearly placed there deliberately. It was broadcasting a signal on multiple frequencies, repeating the same message over and over. Beth Nightshade's technical officer managed to intercept and decode the message. It was surprisingly simple. The message contained coordinates for a meeting location, a time frame for the meeting that began in 2 days, and a request for diplomatic contact. The message also included a designation for the beings sending it. The word they used for themselves translated approximately as humanity or human collective. Lyra studied the satellite device carefully without touching it. The construction was fascinating. It used purely technological systems with no magical components whatsoever. The power source appeared to be a small fusion reactor, something elven ships had moved beyond centuries ago in favor of zero-point energy extraction. Yet despite being technologically primitive, the device was built with such precision that it could probably function for decades without maintenance. Around the satellite, they found other artifacts floating in the void. Weapons that used chemical propulsion to launch metal projectiles at high velocity. Computing devices that operated on binary logic circuits instead of quantum probability matrices. Fragments of hull plating that appeared to be simple metal alloys rather than the living crystalline structures that elven ships used. Everything pointed to a civilization that had achieved spaceflight and advanced technology through purely physical sciences without ever developing magical capabilities. Such beings were theoretically possible, but in all of elven history spanning tens of thousands of years, they had never encountered a species that completely lacked magical potential. Nightwing suddenly became agitated, the same way the dragon had been on the night of the celebration. Lyra felt alarm surge through their bond. She looked where Nightwing was staring, and her breath caught in her throat. At the very edge of their sensor range, dozens of massive hyperspace signatures were appearing. Ships, huge ones. More were appearing every second. Beth immediately ordered the reconnaissance team into defensive formation. The Dragon Riders spread out, creating a perimeter while their sensor operators worked frantically to gather data on the approaching fleet. The numbers kept climbing. 50 ships, 100, 200. The signatures kept multiplying. Lyra made the decision to retreat and report this to the High Council immediately. But before they could turn back toward home, one of the approaching ships accelerated ahead of the others. It moved with startling speed, crossing distances that should have taken hours in mere minutes. The ship positioned itself between the Elven reconnaissance team and their home system, not in a threatening posture, but clearly blocking their path. The ship was enormous, easily 3 times the size of an Elven cruiser. Its hull was gray metal covered in strange markings and symbols. Massive engines glowed with blue-white light at its rear. Weapon ports lined its sides, though none were currently powered. The ship simply floated there, waiting, as if to say that the time for hiding and observation had ended. From the ship, a new transmission arrived. This one was different from the simple meeting request. It contained visual and audio data. The image showed a being, one of the humans, standing in what appeared to be a command center. The human wore a dark uniform, with insignias that likely denoted rank. Her features were female, with short brown hair and eyes that held both intelligence and determination. The human spoke, and the translation came through clearly thanks to the sophisticated language matrix included with the transmission. She introduced herself with a name that sounded like Amy Rodriguez and a title that translated to captain or ship commander. She stated that humanity requested diplomatic audience with the Elven leadership. She emphasized that they came in peace, but also came prepared to defend themselves if necessary. Lyra felt Nightwing's unease mixing with her own. Something about this Captain Rodriguez seemed genuine, but also calculating. The human had timed everything perfectly, appearing at exactly the right moment to prevent retreat while also maintaining a non-aggressive stance. This was not the action of a primitive species stumbling into first contact. This was the work of skilled strategists who had planned every move carefully. Before Lyra could formulate a response, the High Council's flagship emerged from a portal gate behind them. The Council had been monitoring the reconnaissance mission and had dispatched their own forces the moment the human fleet appeared. At the head of the flagship stood Counselor Kate Sunfire, the most hawkish member of the Council and a powerful warrior in her own right. Kate's message transmitted to all elven forces and to the human ship. Her tone carried absolute authority and barely concealed threat. She declared that the humans had entered sacred elven territory without permission. She demanded that they turn back immediately or face the full might of the Elven Empire. There would be no diplomatic audience until the human fleet retreated beyond elven borders. The response from Captain Rodriguez came quickly. The human captain's expression remained calm, but her words carried steel beneath the polite phrasing. She stated that humanity had vital information about the Crithian swarm. She revealed that the swarm fleet the elves had recently defeated was not the main force. It was merely a scouting party. The true swarm armada was still coming, and it numbered in the thousands of bioships. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face. If this was true, if the massive victory they had celebrated was actually just a minor skirmish against a much larger threat, then everything changed. The whole galaxy was in more danger than anyone had realized. Captain Rodriguez made one final statement that silenced all protest from the elven forces. She revealed that humanity had been fighting the Crithian swarm for 50 years. They had been watching the elven conflict with the swarm and waiting for the right moment to make contact. And now, with the true swarm armada only months away from elven space, that moment had arrived. The revelation about the true size of the Crithian swarm armada shattered the fragile peace that had settled over the Elven Empire. Within hours of Captain Rodriguez's transmission, the High Council chamber became a battlefield of heated arguments and conflicting strategies. The Council members divided into two clear factions almost immediately. One side, led by Counselor Kate Sunfire, wanted to activate the reality-warping defensive shields around their core worlds and let humanity face the swarm alone. The other faction, smaller but growing, recognized that even their most powerful defenses might not withstand an armada of thousands of bioships. Lyra stood before the Council, presenting her assessment of the human fleet she had observed. She explained that while their technology appeared primitive in some ways, the coordination and discipline of the human forces suggested decades or even centuries of continuous warfare experience. The humans had survived 50 years of fighting the swarm, something that spoke to remarkable resilience and adaptability. She argued that dismissing them as inferior would be a potentially fatal mistake. Counselor Maya Starweaver supported Lyra's position and added intelligence reports that painted an even more complex picture. Maya's analysts had been studying the data fragments recovered from the monitoring stations and had made disturbing discoveries. The humans had been observing elven space for at least 70 years based on references in their logs. They had known exactly where to find the Elven Empire and had deliberately waited to make contact until after the elves had fought their war with the swarm scouts. This suggested long-term strategic planning that went far beyond simple exploration. The debate raged for 2 full days, while the human fleet maintained position at the border of Elven territory. Captain Rodriguez sent additional transmissions offering to share intelligence about the swarm and requesting permission to send a diplomatic delegation. Each time, Counselor Kate Sunfire rejected the offer and demanded the humans retreat. The standoff seemed likely to continue indefinitely until an unexpected voice broke the deadlock. Commander Beth Nightshade requested permission to address the Council, an unusual move for a military officer of her rank. Beth argued that regardless of human motives or trustworthiness, the facts about the swarm could be verified independently. She proposed sending an elven deep space reconnaissance mission to confirm whether a massive swarm armada actually existed. If Captain Rodriguez was telling the truth, they would need allies. If she was lying, They would know the humans could not be trusted. The council agreed to this sensible compromise. Lyra volunteered to lead the reconnaissance mission personally. She took Nightwing and 5 other Dragon Riders on a long-range patrol that pushed deep into the territory where the swarm scouts had originated. What they found there exceeded even the worst projections from Captain Rodriguez's warnings. The swarm was indeed gathering a massive armada. Thousands of bioships clustered around a captured star system, feeding on its resources and breeding more warriors. The hive mind was preparing for a migration, and the trajectory calculations showed it heading directly toward Elven space. The reconnaissance team barely escaped detection by the swarm's sensor organisms. They returned to Ethermoor with incontrovertible evidence that validated everything Captain Rodriguez had said. The council meeting that followed was brief and decisive. Counselor Kate Sunfire, faced with the reality of the threat, withdrew her objections to human contact. The vote to accept diplomatic audience passed with only 2 dissenting voices. Captain Rodriguez arrived on Ethermoor 3 days later aboard a smaller vessel designated as a diplomatic shuttle. She brought with her a delegation of human officers and scientists. Lyra met them at the landing platform, along with a full honor guard. It was the first time she had seen humans in person, rather than through images and transmissions. They were indeed remarkably similar to elves in basic form, but with subtle differences that became more apparent up close. The humans moved with a contained energy that reminded Lyra of warriors who had spent their lives in combat zones. Their eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, evaluating threats and escape routes even in this supposedly safe, diplomatic setting. Captain Rodriguez herself was younger than Lyra had expected, probably not more than 40 or 50 years old by human standards. For a species that likely lived only a fraction of elven lifespans, that meant Rodriguez had spent most of her adult life fighting the swarm. The diplomatic discussions began in one of the council's formal chambers, but quickly moved to more practical settings. Captain Rodriguez made it clear that humanity did not have time for extended negotiations and ceremonial protocols. The swarm armada was already in motion. They had perhaps 4 months before it reached the outer elven systems, not the 6 months originally estimated. Every day spent in debate was a day lost to preparation. Rodriguez proposed a joint war council with equal representation from both species. She offered to share humanity's complete database on swarm tactics, biology, and weaknesses. In exchange, she requested access to elven portal technology and magical weapon systems. She explained that human forces had learned to fight the swarm through overwhelming firepower and unpredictable tactics, but lacked the ability to strike quickly across vast distances. Elven portal gates could solve that problem. The council was hesitant to share portal technology with beings they had known for less than a week. The gates were one of the Elven Empire's most closely guarded secrets. But Captain Rodriguez made a compelling argument. She brought forth star charts showing the extent of swarm territory and the paths of their previous conquests. 17 civilizations had fallen before the swarm's endless hunger. All of them had tried to fight alone, hoarding their secrets and technologies until it was too late. Humanity had survived by being willing to adapt, to steal swarm biotechnology and repurpose it, to fight in ways that ignored conventional rules of warfare. Lyra found herself convinced by the human captain's logic, even as it made her uncomfortable. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated the kind of ruthless pragmatism that came from fighting an existential war for decades. She was willing to do whatever was necessary to survive, including forming alliances with species she barely understood. The Joint War Council was established with Lyra and Rodriguez serving as co-commanders. This arrangement satisfied the Elven need for a known and trusted leader while also acknowledging human expertise in fighting the swarm. Commander Beth Nightshade was appointed as Lyra's primary liaison to human forces. On the human side, a Marine officer named Lieutenant Beth Harris took the corresponding role. The first joint planning session revealed just how differently the two species approached warfare. Human tactics relied heavily on what they called combined arms integration, using nuclear weapons to break swarm formations, followed by kinetic bombardment from orbit. Then ground forces with biological and chemical weapons to eliminate survivors. Elven commanders were shocked by the brutality of these methods. Elven warfare, while certainly deadly, followed ancient codes of honor and sought to minimize collateral damage. Captain Rodriguez explained patiently that the swarm had no concept of honor and felt no pain. It was a hive mind that viewed individual bioships as expendable cells in a larger organism. The only way to defeat it was through methods so destructive and chaotic that the hive mind could not adapt quickly enough. Surgical strikes and honorable combat were luxuries that species facing the swarm could not afford. To demonstrate human capabilities, Rodriguez invited Lyra and select Elven commanders to tour the human flagship, a massive vessel called the UES Valkyrie. What Lyra saw aboard that ship both horrified and amazed her. The humans had entire laboratories dedicated to studying captured swarm organisms. They had successfully reprogrammed some of the simpler swarm bioforms to fight for humanity. The research teams included scientists who had been born in refugee camps after their homeworlds fell to the swarm. These humans had never known peace. War was their entire existence. The Marine complement aboard the Valkyrie consisted of soldiers like Lieutenant Beth Harris and her squad leader, Sergeant Kate Mitchell. These warriors trained constantly in simulated swarm environments. They fought in powered armor suits that enhanced their strength and speed. Their weapons ranged from plasma rifles to man-portable nuclear charges. Every Marine Lyra met had the same hard look in their eyes, the look of people who had seen friends and family consumed by the swarm and kept fighting anyway. Nightwing accompanied Lyra on the tour of the Valkyrie, and the dragon's reaction was unexpected. Rather than showing the unease that Nightwing had displayed when the human fleet first arrived, the dragon seemed almost curious about the humans. Nightwing allowed human technicians to approach and take measurements, something the dragon rarely permitted even with trusted elves. Several Marines asked if they could touch Nightwing's scales, and the dragon tolerated it with surprising patience. Captain Rodriguez explained that humans had legends of dragons in their ancient history, creatures of power and wisdom that appeared in myths across many cultures. Seeing a real dragon affected the human crew deeply. Some approached with almost religious reverence, while others seemed to view Nightwing as the ultimate combat asset waiting to be deployed. The cultural exchange went both ways. Human soldiers were fascinated by elven magic, something their species apparently lacked entirely. An elven mage named Lisa Starlight demonstrated basic elemental manipulation, creating fire from air and reshaping metal with thought alone. The humans watched in wonder and immediately began theorizing about how such abilities might be used in combat against the swarm. Not everyone welcomed the growing cooperation between the species. A faction of radical elves led by Shadow Captain Claire Duskblade viewed humanity as a potential future threat. Claire argued that once the swarm was defeated, the humans would turn their weapons against the Elven Empire. She pointed to the fact that humans had been watching Elven space for 70 years without revealing themselves. That kind of patient observation suggested intelligence gathering for eventual conquest. Claire and her followers attempted to sabotage several human ships docked at Elven orbital stations. The sabotage was discovered before it could cause serious damage, but the incident created a crisis of trust. Captain Rodriguez demanded that the saboteurs be turned over to human authorities for trial. The Elven Council refused, insisting on handling the matter through their own justice system. For several tense days, it seemed the alliance might collapse before it truly began. Lyra and Rodriguez worked together to prevent a complete breakdown. They convinced their respective leaderships to establish a joint tribunal that would handle crimes involving both species. Claire Duskblade and her co-conspirators were sentenced to service in the combined fleet's most dangerous assignments. If they truly believed they were protecting the Elven Empire, they would have the chance to prove it by fighting on the front lines against the Swarm. As preparations for war accelerated, new reports arrived that changed everything. The Swarm Armada had not only begun moving toward Elven space, but had accelerated far beyond expected speeds. The bioships were burning through resources at an unsustainable rate, suggesting that something had triggered an urgent migration rather than a planned conquest. Captain Rodriguez and Lyra studied the data together, trying to understand what could cause such behavior. The answer came from an unlikely source. A human deep space monitoring station at the far edge of their territory detected anomalous energy signatures behind the Swarm Armada. Something was chasing the Swarm, pushing it forward in a panic. Whatever this unknown force was, it had frightened a hive mind composed of trillions of individual organisms. And then the long-range sensors detected the leading edge of the Swarm vanguard entering the outer reaches of Elven territory. The enemy had arrived not in months or weeks, but in hours. Every ship, every warrior, every weapon system they had prepared would be needed immediately. The time for planning and debate had ended. The war for survival was beginning right now. The Swarm vanguard hit the outer Elven defense perimeter like a tidal wave of living darkness. Thousands of bioships emerged from hyperspace in a coordinated assault that stretched across 3 star systems simultaneously. The creatures were massive organisms bred for war, each one capable of firing bioplasma that could melt through capital ship armor. They moved with the coordination of a single mind, because that was exactly what they were. Individual cells in a vast consciousness that spanned light years. Lyra rode Nightwing at the head of the combined fleet's first response wing. Around her flew 50 dragon riders from the Elven Sky Fleet, each mounted on their bonded companions. Beside them flew human fighter squadrons in sleek combat craft, bristling with missile pods and railguns. It was a formation that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks ago. The two species had trained together for barely 10 days before being thrown into actual combat. The initial engagement revealed immediately that this swarm was different from the one the elves had fought before. The bioships demonstrated tactical adaptations specifically designed to counter elven magic and human technology. They released electromagnetic pulse organisms that disrupted human electronics while simultaneously deploying anti-magic spores that interfered with elven spellcasting. The swarm had been studying both species and had evolved countermeasures. Captain Rodriguez commanded the human forces from the bridge of the UES Valkyrie, while Elven Admiral Beth Starfury coordinated the Sky Fleet from her flagship Eternal Dawn. The two commanders maintained constant communication through the Joint Command Network. Rodriguez called for immediate nuclear strikes on the swarm concentrations, while Beth Starfury deployed portal gates to evacuate damaged ships and reposition forces. Lyra led her wing in close combat against a cluster of bioships that were attempting to breach the defensive line around an elven colony world. Nightwing's breath weapon, superheated plasma channeled through draconic magic, carved through swarm organisms with devastating effect. But for every bioship destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The swarm was not just attacking, it was testing, probing, learning how the combined forces fought. One of Lyra's wing members, a young rider named Maya Thornwood, flew too close to a swarm battleship and was caught by its tentacle weapons. Lyra watched in horror as the tentacles began pulling Maya and her dragon toward the bioship's maw. Without hesitation, she dove Nightwing into an attack run, firing concentrated magical energy that severed the tentacles. She grabbed Maya's dragon with Nightwing's claws and pulled them both clear just as the battleship exploded from a human missile strike. The battle raged for 6 hours across multiple fronts. Human Marines deployed onto several swarm-boarding organisms that had attached themselves to elven orbital stations. Lieutenant Beth Harris led her squad through the organic corridors of a swarm infiltrator, using flamethrowers and explosive charges to clear out the parasite creatures that bred inside. They met elven defenders, including Ranger Captain Maya Thornwood, who had been holding a critical shield generator against overwhelming odds. The combined human and elven ground forces fought side by side for the first time. They discovered that their methods complemented each other. Human weapons were effective at destroying swarm mass, while elven magic excelled at precision strikes against swarm control nodes. Together, they could clear spaces that neither could handle alone. In orbit above the embattled colony world, the Valkyrie and Eternal Dawn coordinated a massive counterattack. Human carriers launched waves of nuclear-tipped missiles, while elven battleships opened portal gates that redirected the blasts directly into swarm formations. The explosions created gaps in the swarm lines that dragon riders exploited with devastating effectiveness. But the swarm adapted with terrifying speed. Midway through the battle, the bioships began deploying what human sensors identified as portal disruption organisms. These creatures generated fields that interfered with elven gate technology, preventing quick repositioning of forces. At the same time, new swarm variants appeared that were heavily shielded against nuclear radiation. The hive mind was learning and evolving in real time. Captain Rodriguez made a difficult call. She ordered the use of biological weapons, releasing genetically engineered viruses designed to attack swarm nervous systems. The elven commanders protested, viewing biological warfare as dishonorable and dangerous. But Rodriguez pointed out that the swarm itself was a biological weapon, and fighting it with conventional ethics would lead to extinction. Admiral Beth Starfury reluctantly agreed and authorized the deployment. The biological weapons proved devastatingly effective. Thousands of swarm bioships began convulsing and losing coordination. The hive mind's control over them weakened as the virus spread through their organic computer networks. For the first time in the battle, the combined forces gained clear advantage. They pressed the attack, destroying crippled swarm vessels and pushing the enemy back toward the system's edge. But victory came at terrible cost. Over 30 dragon riders had been killed, including Wing Commander Kate Sunfire, one of the council members who had initially opposed the alliance with humanity. Her dragon, Starfire, refused to leave her fallen rider's body and fought alone against impossible odds until both were consumed by swarm organisms. The sacrifice bought time for evacuation ships to escape, but the loss struck the elven forces hard. Human casualties were equally severe. 3 entire Marine companies were lost holding ground positions against swarm landing forces. The UES destroyer Courage was torn apart by swarm battleships after its engines failed. Over 2,000 human personnel died in the first engagement alone. Captain Rodriguez personally recorded each name, maintaining a list that she had been keeping for 50 years of warfare. As the swarm vanguard retreated from the system, Lyra and Rodriguez met aboard the Valkyrie to assess the situation. The victory had been Pyrrhic at best. They had stopped the initial assault, but both commanders knew this was just the beginning. The main swarm armada was still weeks away, and it would be exponentially larger than the vanguard force they had barely defeated. During the assessment meeting, Counselor Maya Starweaver presented disturbing intelligence gathered during the battle. The swarm's adaptations had been too rapid and too specific. The countermeasures against elven magic and human technology should have taken months or years to develop through normal evolution. Instead, the swarm had deployed them within hours of first contact. This suggested that the hive mind had access to detailed information about both species before the battle even began. Captain Rodriguez and Lyra discussed possibilities. The most likely explanation was that the swarm had been studying both civilizations for far longer than anyone realized. But Maya proposed a more troubling theory. What if the swarm was being guided by something else, something that wanted the two species to fight and weaken each other before the main invasion began? The evidence supporting this theory came from sensor logs recovered from destroyed swarm bioships. Deep in their organic memory tissues, analysts found fragments of transmissions that did not match swarm communication patterns. The transmissions were highly compressed data packets sent on frequencies that neither elves nor humans used. They appeared to be status reports being sent somewhere beyond the battle zone. Lyra examined the data personally and felt a chill run through her. The transmission vectors pointed toward a region of space that both elven and human star charts marked as unexplored and uninhabited. Yet clearly something was out there, watching and directing events from the shadows. The swarm was not just a mindless plague consuming everything in its path. It was being aimed like a weapon at specific targets. This revelation changed the strategic situation completely. If an unknown third party was controlling or influencing the swarm, then defeating the bioships would not end the threat. They would need to identify and confront whoever or whatever was truly responsible. But with the main swarm armada approaching, there was no time for investigation. They had to focus on immediate survival. Captain Rodriguez proposed a radical solution. She explained that human forces had been developing something experimental, a way to fight the swarm using its own nature against it. The project was called Soulbind, and it involved temporary fusion of consciousness between living beings and artificial intelligence systems. Humans had attempted it with their ship computers, but the integration was imperfect because humans lacked the natural telepathic abilities that such fusion required. But dragons were different. Dragons were ancient creatures with innate magical and telepathic capabilities. If a dragon could bond with a human ship's AI core, the resulting hybrid might combine the best qualities of both: magical power and technological precision, organic intuition, and computational speed. It was the kind of fusion that could produce a weapon the swarm could not predict or counter. Lyra understood the implications immediately. Rodriguez was asking the dragon riders to volunteer their bonded companions for an experimental procedure that might succeed or might kill them. It was asking dragons who had served the Elven Empire for millennia to merge temporarily with human machines. The political and cultural implications were staggering. Nightwing surprised everyone by being the first to volunteer. The great dragon communicated through the bond with Lyra that the enemy they faced was unlike anything in living memory. Traditional methods would fail. New approaches were necessary. Other dragons quickly followed Nightwing's example, showing the trust they had developed in their human allies, despite such short acquaintance. The Soulbind procedure took 3 days to prepare. Human technicians worked alongside elven mages to create the neural interface systems that would allow dragon consciousness to merge with ship AI cores. The first test subject was Nightwing bonding with the Valkyrie's primary computer. Lyra stayed by the dragon's side throughout the process, feeling every moment of discomfort and alien sensation through their bond. When the fusion completed, something entirely new emerged. The Valkyrie became more than just a ship controlled by computers. It became a living vessel with Nightwing's awareness spread through its systems. The dragon could feel the ship's sensors as extensions of its own senses, could fire weapons with thought alone, could manipulate the ship's position in space using a combination of engine thrust and magical propulsion. The hybrid was everything Rodriguez had hoped and more. 15 other dragons underwent the same procedure with different human ships. Each fusion created unique results based on the individual personalities of the dragons involved. Some dragons bonded better with fighter craft, creating incredibly agile combat units. Others merged with larger vessels, turning battleships into flying fortresses with unprecedented power. The Joint Command began integrating these new hybrid warships into their defensive strategies. Training exercises showed capabilities that seemed impossible. A dragon-bonded fighter could dodge incoming fire by predicting attacks through magical precognition while simultaneously calculating optimal firing solutions through computer targeting systems. A dragon-bonded battleship could maintain defensive shields through magic while allocating all power to weapons, effectively breaking the normal limits of power distribution. But as these preparations continued, long-range sensors detected something that made all previous concerns seem trivial. The main swarm armada had arrived ahead of schedule, not in weeks as predicted, but in 3 days. And it was not alone. Behind the bioships, barely visible at extreme sensor range, were massive structures that matched no known biological or technological patterns. The mysterious third party was no longer hiding in shadows. They were coming to observe the final battle directly. The main swarm armada emerged into elven space like a living nightmare given form. 10,000 bioships of every size and function filled the void between stars, blotting out distant galaxies with their mass. The hive mind had committed everything to this assault, abandoning its other territories to focus overwhelming force on destroying the elven-human alliance. Sensor readings showed that the swarm had cannibalized entire star systems to fuel this armada, consuming planets and stars to breed more warriors. Lyra stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie, her consciousness intertwined with Nightwing's as the dragon maintained fusion with the ship's AI core. Through this triple awareness of elf, dragon, and machine, she could perceive the battle developing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. She saw the tactical display showing fleet positions. She felt Nightwing's ancient combat instincts evaluating threats. She processed the ship computer's probability calculations for thousands of possible engagement scenarios. Captain Rodriguez stood beside her, coordinating the combined fleet's response. Around them, bridge crew members worked with controlled urgency, managing weapon systems and defensive arrays. The Valkyrie had become the flagship for the entire Allied force through necessity. Its fusion of human technology and dragon consciousness gave it capabilities that made it uniquely suited to serve as command center. Admiral Beth Starfury commanded the elven contingent from the Eternal Dawn, now bonded with the dragon Starfire who had been Kate Sunfire's companion. The dragon had chosen to continue fighting rather than mourn, channeling grief into determination. Together, Beth and Starfire coordinated portal deployments and magical strike teams across the defensive perimeter. The swarm attacked on 3 fronts simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm defenders through sheer numbers. The first wave consisted of millions of smaller organisms, each about the size of a fighter craft, swarming forward in clouds so dense they appeared as solid masses on sensors. These scouts died easily to defensive fire, but their purpose was clear: absorb ammunition and reveal weapon positions for the larger vessels following behind. Human carriers launched nuclear-tipped missiles by the thousands, while elven battleships created portal gates that redirected the explosions into the heart of swarm formations. The void lit up with atomic fire as entire cubic kilometers of space became temporary suns. Millions of swarm organisms died in the initial bombardment, but millions more pressed forward undeterred. Dragon-bonded ships proved their worth immediately. Lieutenant Beth Harris commanded a fighter squadron merged with the Dragon Moonfire and led devastating hit-and-run attacks that destroyed swarm command nodes. The hybrid fighters could portal jump short distances using dragon magic while maintaining full weapons capability, striking from impossible angles and vanishing before counterattacks could reach them. On the ground, swarm forces made landfall on 3 elven colony worlds despite orbital defenses. Millions of parasite organisms began consuming everything organic, spreading like plague across continents. Human marines and elven rangers deployed to hold critical population centers. Sergeant Kate Mitchell led her squad through burning cities, evacuating civilians while fighting rearguard actions against endless waves of swarm creatures. Ranger Captain Maya Thornwood coordinated evacuation efforts on the colony World Haven, working alongside human logistics officers to move hundreds of thousands of refugees through portal gates to safer locations. The cooperation between species had become seamless through necessity. Survival depended on trusting each other completely. In orbit above Haven, the dragon-bonded battleship Eternal Courage held position against impossible odds. The ship's fusion of dragon consciousness and human weapon systems allowed it to maintain defensive coverage over evacuation sites while simultaneously engaging swarm capital ships. But even hybrid vessels had limits. Eternal Courage took catastrophic damage protecting refugee transports and was eventually consumed by swarm boarders after its crew evacuated. The battle raged for 18 hours without pause. Both sides committed everything they had. The swarm threw bioships forward in suicidal charges, while the Allied forces countered with every weapon system in their arsenals. Entire moons were shattered by orbital bombardment, planets burned under biological warfare agents, the void filled with debris and frozen bodies from dozens of destroyed vessels. Lyra coordinated strike forces while maintaining awareness of the larger strategic situation through her fusion with Nightwing and the Valkyrie. She noticed patterns in the swarm's attacks that troubled her. The hive mind was fighting with desperation rather than its usual cold calculation. The bioships kept glancing backward at their own rear sensors, as if expecting something to emerge from behind them. Captain Rodriguez noticed the same thing and ordered long-range reconnaissance drones to investigate the space behind the swarm armada. What they found confirmed the suspicions that had been building since the Vanguard battle. Massive structures floated in the void beyond the swarm forces, structures that were neither biological nor technological in any conventional sense. They appeared to be observing platforms of some kind, monitoring the battle with arrays of sensors that operated on principles unknown to either human or elven science. Maya Starweaver, working from the intelligence center aboard the Eternal Dawn, analyzed data from the reconnaissance drones. She discovered that the mysterious structures were broadcasting control signals to the swarm on the same frequencies detected in earlier transmission fragments. The structures were not just observing, they were directing the swarm's tactics, pushing the bioships forward even when tactical withdrawal would be more logical. Lyra and Rodriguez made a decision that would determine the outcome of everything. They could continue fighting the swarm and probably achieve victory, but at such horrific cost that both civilizations would be crippled. Or they could take a desperate gamble and strike at the real enemy, the unknown force controlling the swarm from behind. If they succeeded, the hive mind might lose coordination and become vulnerable. If they failed, the swarm would overrun their defenses while their best forces were committed elsewhere. The combined command staff took exactly 17 minutes to debate and approve the plan. They would split their forces. Admiral Beth Starfury would maintain defensive positions with 60% of the fleet, holding the line against swarm bioships through sheer determination. Lyra and Rodriguez would take the dragon-bonded ships and humanity's most advanced stealth vessels on a strike mission to destroy the observation platforms. The strike force consisted of 12 dragon-bonded hybrid ships, including the Valkyrie, and 30 human stealth destroyers equipped with experimental weapons. They disengaged from the main battle and used elven portal gates to jump behind the swarm armada, emerging within weapons range of the mysterious observation platforms. Up close, the structures were even more disturbing. They appeared to be constructed from materials that existed partially outside normal space-time, flickering between dimensions in ways that made them difficult to target. Energy readings showed power sources that dwarfed anything the Allied forces possessed. These were not scout ships or research stations. They were warships designed by a civilization far more advanced than either humans or elves. Before the strike force could attack, the observation platforms activated defensive systems. Beams of directed energy lanced out, moving faster than light itself through some form of tachyon manipulation. 2 human destroyers were obliterated instantly, their crews dead before they could even register the attack. The remaining ships scattered and returned fire with every weapon available. Lyra guided the Valkyrie through evasive maneuvers that combined human tactical AI with Nightwing's combat instincts and elven magical defenses. Nuclear missiles detonated against energy shields that shouldn't exist. Magical attacks dissipated against hull materials that seemed immune to supernatural forces. Nothing they tried had any significant effect on the observation platforms. Then Nightwing perceived something through the fusion with the ship's sensors. Something that the dragon's ancient knowledge recognized, even if modern science could not explain it. The observation platforms were not autonomous. They were being controlled remotely from somewhere else, somewhere close but hidden. Nightwing's draconic senses evolved over millions of years to hunt prey that could camouflage itself across dimensional barriers. Detected the hidden command ship. The command vessel revealed itself as Nightwing focused dragon-enhanced sensors on its position. It was small compared to the observation platforms, barely larger than a human cruiser, but its design was elegant in a way that suggested supreme confidence. The hull was smooth and featureless, constructed from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No visible weapons or engines marked its surface, yet it moved with fluid grace through the void. Captain Rodriguez made the call to focus all attacks on the command ship. If they could destroy or disable it, the observation platforms might lose coordination. The strike force converged on the target, launching everything they had. For several seconds, it seemed as though their attacks would fail. The command ship's defenses absorbed nuclear strikes and magical assaults without visible damage. Then something unexpected happened. The ship's shields flickered and weakened for just an instant. Not because of the Allied attacks, but because something else was targeting it from a different direction. Long-range sensors detected 3 more ships emerging from hyperspace, ships with design aesthetics similar to the command vessel, but clearly in opposition to it. The newcomers opened fire on the command ship with weapons that bypassed its defenses entirely. The command ship attempted to escape, but was too late. Precision strikes from the new arrivals crippled its engines and disabled its shields. As its defenses failed, the observation platforms lost coordination and began drifting aimlessly. The swarm armada, suddenly without guidance, became disorganized and confused. Lyra and Rodriguez watched in stunned silence as one of the newly arrived ships broadcast a message on all frequencies. The transmission contained visual data showing humanoid figures that appeared similar to elves, but with subtle differences. They claimed to be representatives of an ancient civilization that had been monitoring the galaxy for millennia. The command ship they had disabled belonged to a rogue faction of their own species, one that had been conducting unauthorized experiments on younger civilizations. The message explained that the rogue faction had been using the swarm as a weapon to test how different species responded to existential threats. They had deliberately guided the bioships toward both elven and human territories to observe how the 2 civilizations would react. The goal had been to gather data on combat effectiveness, technological adaptation, and alliance formation under extreme pressure. The representatives apologized for not intervening sooner, but explained that internal politics within their civilization had prevented direct action until now. They promised that the rogue faction would face justice and that the swarm would be contained and redirected away from inhabited space. They requested peaceful contact with both elven and human leadership to discuss formal diplomatic relations. Captain Rodriguez responded with controlled fury. She demanded to know how many civilizations had been destroyed in these experiments. How many billions had died to satisfy the curiosity of beings who viewed entire species as laboratory specimens? The representatives acknowledged that the cost had been terrible and inexcusable. That was precisely why they were intervening now. The conversation was interrupted by urgent warnings from the main battle zone. The swarm, although disorganized, was still attacking in massive numbers. Admiral Beth Starfury's defensive forces had been holding for hours, but casualties were becoming unsustainable. The strike force needed to return immediately if there was any hope of victory. Lyra made a decision. She accepted the representative's offer of assistance on one condition. They would help destroy the remaining swarm bioships immediately. The representatives agreed, and their 3 warships joined the Allied fleet. What followed was a demonstration of technological supremacy that awed even human observers. The ancient civilization's weapons could destroy entire swarm formations with single shots, disintegrating bioships through some form of directed entropy manipulation. With this assistance, the battle turned decisively. The swarm's remaining forces were systematically eliminated over the next 6 hours. The hive mind, already weakened by loss of external control, could not adapt quickly enough to counter threats from multiple technological paradigms simultaneously. As the last bioships died, a strange silence fell across the battlefield. The cost of victory was staggering. Over 40,000 elves had died, including hundreds of dragon riders. Human casualties exceeded 100,000 with dozens of ships destroyed. 3 entire colony worlds would require decades to recover from swarm infestation. The Allied forces had won, but both civilizations were severely weakened. In the aftermath, Lyra and Captain Rodriguez stood together watching recovery operations. Dragon-bonded ships had begun separating, allowing the dragons to return to independent existence. Nightwing settled beside Lyra, exhausted but alive, the bond between them stronger than ever after sharing consciousness with the Valkyrie. The representatives of the ancient civilization requested formal meetings with both the Elven High Council and human leadership. They offered technology sharing and alliance as reparation for the damage caused by their rogue faction. They also warned that the galaxy contained other threats, some even more dangerous than the swarm. Humanity and the Elven Empire would need allies in the conflicts to come. Counselor Maya Starweaver presented one final revelation during the initial diplomatic discussions. Her analysts had discovered something disturbing in the ancient ruins that human explorers had mentioned finding before the war. The ruins contained statues depicting humans, elves, and dragons together in what appeared to be cooperative ventures. Carbon dating suggested the statues were over 10,000 years old. The representatives confirmed what this implied. Humans and elves were not separate species that had evolved independently. They shared common ancestors, populations that had been separated and guided along different evolutionary paths by ancient civilizations conducting long-term experiments. Dragons had been part of these experiments as well, bioengineered guardians designed to protect the developing species. This knowledge changed everything. The war between elves and swarm, the alliance with humanity, even the revelation of ancient observers watching from shadows, all of it was part of something much larger. They were players in games that had been running for thousands of years, games whose full scope and purpose remained hidden. Lyra stood with Nightwing as the first joint human-elven colony was established on a world recovering from swarm damage. She watched human engineers and elven mages working together to rebuild, creating something new from the ashes of war. Captain Rodriguez joined her, and together they looked toward the stars where ancient civilizations waited with unknown intentions. They had celebrated victory once before, only to discover humans approaching. Now they had won again, but learned that humans and elves alike were pieces in games beyond their understanding. There would be no premature celebrations this time. Both species knew that the real challenges were just beginning. But at least now they would face those challenges together, united by bonds forged in the crucible of shared survival. Nightwing rumbled softly, and Lyra felt the dragon's thoughts through their bond. The ancient creature was not afraid of what lay ahead. Dragons had survived for millions of years by adapting to change and choosing allies wisely. The elven-human alliance would endure because it was built on more than convenience. It was built on mutual respect earned through blood and sacrifice. As the twin suns set over the rebuilding colony, Lyra allowed herself a small smile. They had won not by being the strongest or most advanced civilization, but by being willing to trust each other when it mattered most. That lesson would serve them well in whatever conflicts the future held. The galaxy was vast and full of mysteries, but now they would explore it together, ready for whatever revelations awaited them among the stars.